Hello, everybody who has joined in already. We will wait for a few more to join in. And before we kick off this evening's webinar, we have a very interesting paper, of course, and we have a very interesting discussant as well. So let's wait for a minute before we start off. So we have some audience and we will start off now. We'll do justice to those who came in time. And today's paper has a very interesting title, and the paper is equally interesting. Does co-residence with parents-in-law reduce women's employment in India? And we know this is possibly peculiar to India. The authors will know this better, though, that co-residence is a very South Asian phenomena. And what is the impact of this on employment is a question that's always kind of bothered me. But it's great that Rajshri Jayaraman has addressed this question with her co-author, Bisma Khan. So Raji, as she's called, is from ESMT Berlin. And she's also associated with the University of Toronto. That's where Bisma Khan is as well. So the two of them together have used the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey data and also the IHDS data. So the combination of these two data has been put together to address a very important question on hand. And a very warm welcome to you, Raji, to this webinar. We look forward to hearing what your results are. And we have with us also Dr. Ashwini Deshpande from Ashoka University. She is not new to this webinar. She has already presented a couple of papers on this webinar in the past, and we are happy to have her here as a discussant today. So welcome, very warm welcome, Ashwini, to you as well. And without much ado, I will pass on this to Rajshri Jayaraman. But before that, anyone who has questions to ask may please type in the questions in the Q&A box, and Raji will find time in between or at the end of the show to answer them. We'll try and answer all the questions. All the Q&As will be transcribed later on by us, and Preetha Joseph, who's with us anchoring the show, will make them available on our website. And this show itself is being recorded, will be available on our YouTube channel as well. So over to you, Raji. You can share your screen and share your thoughts.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me try and share my screen. Hold on just a second. I should be accustomed to this by now, but of course I'm not. All right, can you see my screen? And if I go to full screen, you should be able to see it too, I hope. Can you see my screen still? Excellent. All right. Well, Mahesh, first of all, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Thank you, Preetha, who any of you that got the invitation today, you recognize her name. Thanks for organizing this as well. So as Mahesh said, this is joint work with Bisma Khan, who's a PhD student at the University of Toronto. So the starting point for this paper, and you can see the title is, Does Co-Residence with Parents-in-Law Reduce Women's Employment in India? We start with two stylized facts. The first is something that I imagine the people in this audience are probably very familiar with, which is that India just has extraordinary low rates of female labor force participation. And employment, you have here a standard cross-country scatter plot with GDP per capita. On the x-axis, female labor force participation on the y-axis. And as you can see, even relative to other countries with similar levels of income, Philippines, Bolivia, Ghana, Vietnam, India just has extremely low female labor force, female employment. So that's stylized fact number one. The second stylized fact, which Mahesh also alluded to, is that you have a high rate of co-residence with parents, okay? And you see that in these data here, which shows the proportion of men in younger age groups living with at least one parent. And you see that in India, this is in the high 50s until 2010. And this is high again compared to other countries even in the same neighborhood. And it is persistently high. Now, because of the tradition of patrilocal exogamy, where married women go to live with their husbands, often in the husband's parents' home, the extension of this is that if you look on the right side of this table, you see that almost no women, married women, are in the same age group are living with their parents. Why is that? Well, because married women then co-reside with parents-in-law. So you have these two stylized facts: low rates of female employment and high rate of married women co-residing with parents-in-law. Now, this high rate of co-residence can be seen in the micro data as well, whether you look at IHDS on the left here or CPHS on the right. So the dashed line is the proportion of women living with parents-in-law. You see that on the right-hand side axes here for the IHDS in the left panel and CPHS on the right. And you can see, looking at the dashed line at the top left of each of these two graphs, that the proportion of married women living with parents-in-law directly upon marriage is higher than 70% in India. Now, this gradually declines over a woman's life cycle, as you see. In the solid line, you see a sort of classic inverted U-shaped curve for employment. And what you can see is that, especially in the younger age groups, there's a negative correlation between co-residence and employment. Now, of course, just because there's a negative correlation doesn't mean that the relationship is causal. So what we do in this paper is ask that question. We have two research questions. The first is this a causal relationship? Does co-residence with fathers and mothers-in-law reduce employment among married women in India? Now, as I go through, you'll see that we sort of attack this from a variety of different angles. We use different data sets. We use different kinds of identification strategies. And there are reasons to quibble with each one of these identification strategies. But what I hope to convince you is the incredible robustness of our finding, no matter what we throw at it, new data, new empirical strategies, whatever. So we're going to start by answering this question. And then the next question is going to be, what types of channels might account for any such reduction in employment of women co-residing with parents-in-law? Now here, the evidence is going to be sort of suggestive. I'm not going to hang my hat determinedly on any given explanation, but in general, you'll see that the evidence seems to point to one particular channel. Okay, so why would I believe that there's a causal link between co-residence with parents-in-law and women's employment? There are three reasons for this. The first is that women who co-reside with parents-in-law have the opportunity of sharing income and household assets with parents, with the rest of the family. And this household income sharing can exert a negative impact on female labor force, female labor supply. Why is that? Well, if I can share income and assets with other household members, I don't necessarily have to go out and earn a living. The second channel, the second reason why there may be a causal link is domestic responsibilities. What I mean by that is that if you have, parents-in-law living with you, especially if you're a woman, I'll get to that in a moment, then you're likely to have more domestic responsibilities, which means that you may stay at home rather than go out to work. The final reason to believe that there may be a causal link is social norms. Now, there's a whole lot that's been written in the Indian context about gender-based norms. And we know that in the Indian context, they tend to be conservative in the sense that, women in many situations don't have a whole lot of agency. In this paper, we sort of point to actually the intersection between two types of norms. One is gender-based norms, and the other is the norm of filial piety. And by that, I mean traditionally in Indian families, and some of you may be able to relate to this, you are supposed to defer to elders in the household. So these two norms sort of intersect and mean that more conservative, older household members to whom you're deferring because of the norm of filial piety may impose greater constraints on married women. So you have these three sort of channels that suggest that there may be a causal link between co-residence and employment. Now, in this context, the gender of the co-residing parent-in-law matters, again, for a number of reasons. The first is that men in India tend to have higher employment and therefore income and asset ownership rates than women, which means that co-residence with a father-in-law is more likely to have a negative income effect than co-residence with a mother-in-law. The second is that women tend to be responsible for domestic chores. Women of all generations tend to be responsible for domestic chores, and to the extent that a mother-in-law then shares in the responsibility for these domestic chores with her daughter-in-law, the presence of a mother-in-law may free a daughter-in-law to work in the labor market, whereas a father-in-law is not helping out with domestic chores, which means that his presence doesn't necessarily relieve a daughter-in-law from doing domestic chores, therefore freeing her to work in the labor market. Finally, again, this combination between filial piety and patriarchal norms means that in this intergenerational family with parents-in-law, the father-in-law is likely to have decision-making power because you defer to him, and as a man, you defer to him because he's older, and as a man, he has decision-making authority due to patriarchal norms. And, there may be a caveat here, which is that he has this kind of say in the household outside the kitchen, because the kitchen traditionally is a woman's domain. Okay. All right, there are a few questions here. The first is, can you please explain how household income sharing is having a negative impact on the female labor supply? The channel just is a very simple income effect. The negative income effect basically says if you have higher income, then this exerts a negative effect on labor supply. So to the extent that these intergenerational families with parents-in-law have higher income, a woman reduces her labor supply. The second question from Satakshi Gupta is, doesn't the direction of employment from domestic responsibility, a function of age, capability of parents-in-law, and co-residence could also be helpful in childcare by in-laws and therefore decrease domestic work? Absolutely, Satakshi, and that's something that you'll see I'm going to explore in just a second. So Anindya, I haven't yet talked about estimation. I'll get there in a second. All right. In terms of the related literature, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but let me just say there's a really rich, massive literature exploring India's low female employment rate. There are two parts to this literature, if you like. One is supply side, demand side factors contributing to India's low female employment rate. So like, why aren't companies hiring women in the first place, for example? And the other side is really supply side factors, meaning why are Indian women not supplying their labor into the market? And this paper falls firmly in the second category, supply side factors contributing to India's low female employment rate. Again, there's a massive, really lovely literature on this. Some of it by another co-author of mine, Tanika Chakraborty, and importantly, like really the authority here is Ashwini Deshpande, who is the discussant in this paper. Just a number of really lovely papers talking about this. All right, now in the So what we do in the context of supply side factors is focus on family structure as a supply side constraint to female employment. And in so doing, we add to this is really large old literature in development economics that thinks about the importance of family structure in terms of female employment. Eliana and La Ferrera and Marcel Bachon and co-authors have nice reviews of this literature if you're interested. There are also a few papers that have actually looked precisely at this in the Indian context. And a couple that are really worth mentioning are Debnath's paper and Dhanaraj and Mahambare's paper. What I should say there, what distinguishes our paper from theirs, a number of different things regarding, data and estimation and so forth. But in terms of the content, their focus is on intergeneration. Our focus is on intergenerational co-residence, so with parents-in-law, whereas they're really comparing sort of nuclear families with other sorts of family configurations, joint nuclear versus joint families, and joint families, not the focus just isn't only on the intergenerational part, but also on things like fraternal households or other types of family members living in the household. In addition, we focus really on fathers-in-law and mothers-in-law separately for the reasons I just elucidated regarding the potential importance of the gender of the co-residing parent-in-law. And this sort of sets us apart from a few other recent papers that have really focused on the mother-in-law. And in some sense, like this focus on the mother-in-law is not terribly surprising. In preparation for this talk, I was sort of Googling, the stereotype of the Indian mother-in-law, and it's not pretty. It's really not pretty. They're like in Western movies. There's always like the villain that either has a Russian accent or a British accent, and in India, in the Indian context, like a standard villain in every movie is the mother-in-law. There are actresses who've specialized in the role of the villainous mother-in-law. Aruna Irani, for instance, is one of them. And if you're from Tamil Nadu, where I'm from, Manorama is the classic mother-in-law villain. So, and you open the newspaper every day, like it's sort of this caricature of the villainous mother-in-law. So you'll see in a moment, we have some interesting results there. All right, so in terms of the related literature, again, continuing with that, the other strand of the literature that we contribute to is, again, a large literature in development. I have some, only a few references mentioned here, that talks about how restrictive social norms deter women's employment in developing countries in general and India in particular. And there, what our focus is on here is not just the gender dimension, but sort of the generational norms and the intersection between them. All right, moving along to the data. We have three main data sources. One is the IHDS, the second is the CPHS, thank you very much, Mahesh, and the third is the Indian Time Use Survey. Let me describe each of them briefly in turn. So this is probably more information than the audience here at this seminar needs, but we use the Indian Household Demographic Survey from the two most recent years that we have data for. If there's someone in the audience who has any idea how I can get my hands on the most recent round, please send me an email. I'd really love to get that data. So, as you're familiar with, probably this is a household panel that has super rich demographics. And what we're going to use is, in our full sample, is a balanced panel of married women between the ages of 15 and 70. So, pretty standard working age women. It turns out, as you saw, probably guessed from the graph, it doesn't matter at all if we sort of cut the top end of this distribution. You get the same kind of results. What's cool about the IHDS, and that's a technical term, cool, is that it has a very rich women's questionnaire. And we're going to exploit that later on in the paper when we look at channels that are operating, that may be operating behind the main effects that I'll show you. So here, we're going to use a balanced panel of married women. Again, all of this is just married women between the ages of 15 and 55. By that age group, it's just because that's how this married women's questionnaire is structured in terms of the sample frame. Employment in the IHDS standard definition is if you worked at least 240 hours in an income generating activity in the past year. And Preeti, you had a question about this. I hope that answers this question. And co-residence, remember that's going to be our explanatory variable of interest. Co-residence comes from the household roster, which again is nice in the IHDS because it details relationships between each member of the household to each other. The second data source, which is why I'm presenting the paper here, is the CPHS, and there we use 4 years of data from 2016 to 2019. There are, of course, more recent rounds of the CPHS, but we cut it 2019 just because, then COVID happens and everything's a mess. Again, what's really lovely about the CPHS is it's a household survey and it's a high frequency household survey. And just to preview what is coming next, it's going to be important in terms of one of our estimation strategies. Over here, the CPHS, we're going to use an unbalanced panel of roughly 230,000 married women in total, same age group, not who are observed in every single period, that would result in too much sample loss, but who are observed in at least 2 periods. Employment is defined differently in the CPHS than it is in IHDS. And in fact, every survey sort of has a different definition of employment. So just as a heads up, what that means as we're going along is that you don't want to compare the magnitude of point estimates from one regression to another because baseline rates are extremely different depending on the definition of employment. In the CPHS, employment is you're categorized as being employed if you're employed on the day of or the day before the survey. Co-residence comes from the household roster. Unlike the IHDS, though, CPHS, this tells you the relationship between the person and the household head. Happily, we're able to identify the daughter-in-law and parents-in-law in 98%, roughly 98% of the data. So that doesn't hurt us too much in this context. In terms of summary statistics, as on the left, you have summary statistics for IHDS, on the right, CPHS. What I should have said about the CPHS when I said it's high frequency is that these surveys are take place every quadrimester. And I had to look up what that word meant because we're all familiar with trimesters. That means every 3 months. A quadrimester is every 4 months. So they take place 3 times a year. On the right here, I'm just showing you summary statistics annually, but in each year, there are actually 3 surveys that take place. So you can see that in the IHDS, overall employment in this sample is 42%. And in each of the survey years, we have 33,314 women. CPHS employment, because of this different definition of employment, is considerably lower. Again, you don't want to compare these 2 employment rates. They just follow from the different definitions of employment. The overall employment rate is 11%. And we have almost 2 million observations there, where an observation is a person quadrimester. In terms of co-residence with parents-in-law, you can see that about overall 19% of women co-reside with a father-in-law. In the IHDS, 27% with a mother-in-law. That proportion is obviously higher because women have a longer life expectancy than men do. CPHS, similar pattern in that it's 14% and 19%. You'll note that the co-residence rates are much lower in CPHS than they are in IHDS, and don't know exactly why that is, but you can sort of speculate. The reason is that the urban sample is much larger in CPHS, and co-residence tends to be a less frequent phenomenon in urban areas than it is in rural areas. Okay, so 2 very different data sets, 2 completely different periods, but what you can see is that the overall pattern of employment in the solid blue line here and co-residence with various configurations of parents-in-law is incredibly similar in both of these data sets over a woman's life cycle. Oop, now my computer is freezing up. So, okay, technical issues. Okay, excellent. I said we use 3 data sources. The third is the Indian Time Use Survey. Why do we use this? Because IHDS and CPHS are great for a number of things, but they don't have very rich time use survey. And I'm going to want to use time use survey to explore the domestic responsibilities channel that I talked about earlier. So you may be familiar with the time use survey. It's a little less used. It's super rich and it's much less used than the other 2 data sources. So let me tell you a little bit about it. Again, it's a nationally representative household survey that has a very similar sample frame to the IHDS. It's a single cross section. That's a major drawback of this. But again, super rich time use in that women are asked how they use their time in the last 24 hours in half-hour intervals. So it's from 4 a.m. the previous day to 4 a.m. today. We have 133,000 women, same age group, and co-residence is very similar to what we have in CPHS, and then we glean it from the household roster. Okay. So let me answer a few of these questions as I'm going along. Preeti, I think I answered the question. We're referring to the employment is just defined as it is and includes all employment. And George, that answers your question as well. It's paid employment. Preeti, do we have employment on husband's education, job status, and so forth? Yes, we do for IHDS. And the trouble with, we do for IHDS, we have some of it for the other 2 data sources. The challenge, Preeti, in having information on other household members, depending on your relationship with them, is what we know from the household roster. So in the IHDS, we know the relationship of everyone to everyone in the household. So we can tell who exactly the husband of whom is the parent, the mother-in-law, father-in-law, right? With IHDS and CPHS, there's more measurement error there. And so we have the data for most of it, but we have a bunch of controls. I haven't talked about them. I'll talk about that in just a second when I talk about estimation. But there's a limit to how much we can use them, again, because of the nature of the household roster. All right. That takes care of the questions for now. Okay, let's move on to our empirical model. Standard empirical model on the left-hand side. We have the dependent variable, which is going to equal 1 if woman I is employed at time t and 0 otherwise. Father-in-law, and I'm going to use this acronym a lot, FIL, MIL, that just means father-in-law, mother-in-law, is equal to 1 if the woman co-resides with her father-in-law, 0 otherwise, mother-in-law, similarly defined. We have a whole bunch of controls. I'm not going to talk about them here, but they include, importantly, age, because we want to control for natural variation over a woman's life cycle, bunch of demographic characteristics. We always have district fixed effects. We have much richer demographic characteristics for IHDS than we do for the CPHS, but they're not going to matter very much in the context of our estimation because of the third to last term here, which is individual fixed effects. And the gamma T is time fixed effects, which go for each survey round. All right. So we're going to estimate this model. We're going to start off by estimating this model using a linear probability model, and then we're going to estimate it using individual fixed effects. I'm just going to show you estimates from the linear probability model. Let me also say that we replicate everything using logits and high dimensional fixed effects with logits, and all of the results go through. So just for ease of interpretation, I'm going to show you the linear probability model in the individual fixed effects estimates. Now, adding fixed effects, and George, I hope this answers your question, Yes, it makes sense because it means variation in co-residence comes from variation within a woman over her life cycle, right? So we're using within variation in this context. But of course, it's not really a fix, because co-residence with parents-in-law is endogenous, and the heterogeneity may be time varying, and the direction of the bias for my coefficients on father-in-law and mother-in-law, beta F and beta M, the direction of that bias is ambiguous. For example, suppose I have a negative income shock. Let's say my husband loses his job. Then I may move in with my parents-in-law and have to go out to work. All right, so this would result in upward bias of in this example, beta M. Suppose, on the other hand, that I have a young kid. The kid needs to be taken care of. That means that by moving in with my parents-in-law, I can get some help with childcare, and because I also need to help with childcare, I withdraw from the labor market, and that would result in downward bias of my coefficient estimate. So what we do to deal with this is sort of a two-pronged approach. Okay, again, I don't want to hang my hat on any one of these strategies, but I hope to convince you that together these strategies paint a pretty coherent picture with incredibly robust results, or reasonably robust results. Okay, the first approach is instrumental variables with individual fixed effects. The instrument that I'm going to use is borrowed from Devnath and Dhanaraj and Mahambari's papers, and the instrument is the death of a father-in-law and a mother-in-law, using that as an instrument for co-residence. Now, we don't need to argue about instrument relevance, right? So I hope the instrument is relevant. The question, though, is, strict exogeneity. Conditional on fixed effects, okay, great, but you can ask questions about that. For instance, a father-in-law dies, maybe the husband then inherits a chunk of change, and then the wife doesn't have to go out to work anymore. Or father-in-law dies, now suddenly the son is responsible for all of these, taking care of younger siblings, getting them married, getting them educated, and so forth. And then the wife has to go out and work. Okay, now this is clearly problematic in the IHDS because you have a 7-year interval between survey years. CPHS, much better, right? We have 12 periods of observation. So the maximum interval really is 3 years. And you can argue maybe there can't be like that much going on then, but still you have reasons. If you're skeptical, you have reason to be skeptical. So what we do as a second identification approach is just a completely different approach. It's not compensating for the previous one. It's a completely different approach. It's saying, okay, let's take this threat to identification, instrument exogeneity, seriously. And let's just see what happens then when a parent-in-law dies. So we're basically going to be doing difference and differences using dynamic two-way fixed effect. The event is the death of a father-in-law, and separately the death of a mother-in-law. And then we're going to see what happens to employment before and after the death of a father-in-law or mother-in-law. And this is really like the beautiful thing about CPHS, which is because it's high frequency, it just makes it a compelling strategy, I think, in this context. Now, it's not your get out of jail free card. With every quasi-experimental approach, there are identifying assumptions. And in this case, what we need is strict exogeneity. There are a few parts to this. One is parallel trends. Another part is standard. Another part is no relevant anticipation of treatment. And here's a little graph. I mean, again, can't say this definitively, but over here we have time to a father-in-law's death. 0 is the time of death. Time to a mother-in-law's death. Similar patterns in both. So let's just focus on the left-hand panel here. And we have here whether a father-in-law is healthy. And you see that it's not that there's a systematically dramatic decline prior to the death of either a father-in-law or mother-in-law. So There's some corroborative evidence. The final assumption, of course, is that there's no treatment heterogeneity, meaning women whose parents-in-law die earlier don't respond differently to the death than women whose parents-in-law die later. There's a massive literature on this in the meantime in econometrics, and I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to say we just borrow an estimator off the shelf, which is Callaway and St. Anna with various co-authors and Sun and Abraham's improved doubly robust differences estimator, which takes care of potentially heterogeneous treatment effects. And those are the estimates that I'll be showing you. All right. What I'm going to do next is jump to a couple of tables that show you the regression results. Let me just tell you before I show you the tables what it is that I'm going to be showing you. I'm going to be showing you estimates for beta F and beta M in this regression using linear probability model estimates, individual fixed effects, and IV fixed effects, where my two instruments are a father-in-law died and a mother-in-law died. All right, so first we have these regression results from IHTS. In the top row, you have estimates for beta F, and you can see that, you know, with OLS, without, and with controls, it's robustly negative. So I won't talk about the magnitudes just yet because you should be skeptical about the magnitudes. Once you add individual fixed effects, that the coefficient estimate relative to the OLS estimate falls a little bit. So you have a 4.3 percentage point reduction in employment if the woman lives with a father-in-law. And because the estimates are so similar in columns 2 and 3, this suggests that the variation is really coming from within variation. In column 4, we restrict the sample to women who lived with their parents-in-law in the 2005 survey. Why is that? Well, those are really the women for which this instrument has bite. The results go through if you have the full sample. The coefficient estimates are just implausibly large. 5 and 6, you have first stage estimates for co-residence with a father-in-law. The sign here is sensible. If a father-in-law dies, you're obviously less likely to live with a father-in-law. Similarly, with a mother-in-law, if a mother-in-law dies, you're less likely to live with her. The positive coefficients in these for mother-in-law died in terms of co-residence with a father-in-law, that probably comes from the fact that if you start by living with both parents-in-law and the mother-in-law dies, then you're more likely to be in a father-in-law only configuration. So that's sort of an artifact of the sample restriction in this case. The second stage estimate is minus 0.49, which says that there's a 4.9 percentage point reduction in employment as a result of living with a father-in-law. And given the baseline employment, this amounts to a roughly 11% decrease in employment. If you co-reside with a father-in-law, you see a completely different pattern in terms of co-residence with a mother-in-law. Okay, there's something funky going on here with the OLS in column 2, but in general, the point estimates are pretty close to 0 and statistically insignificant. Same exercise, exactly the same. By the way, we can go through alternative age specifications. Here we have age in sort of lumpy category. You can throw in all sorts of alternative age specifications and all the results go through. Similarly with logits and high dimensional fixed effects with logits. CPHS, let me not spend a whole lot of time because the results are extremely similar with the CPHS as they are with the IHTS. Again, statistically significant and negative across the board for father-in-laws, for co-residence with a father-in-law. The first stage for co-residence with a father-in-law, you see, as you should expect, the coefficient is close to 1 for the death of a father-in-law. It's smaller with mother-in-law, and for mother-in-law, again, it's close to 1. It's close to -1, I should say, not 1, but -1 for the death of the mother-in-law. All right. Second stage estimate, co-residence with a father-in-law, results in a 1.5 percentage point reduction in employment. And remember, the reason this estimate is so much lower than this estimate is just because our baselines are very different because of these different measures of employment. What does that amount to? Well, that amounts to a roughly 13.3% decrease in employment for women co-residing with a father-in-law, and with a mother-in-law, again, completely consistent result in terms of the second stage. Again, our point estimate is close to zero. So co-residence with a mother-in-law has no significant. All right, so what you want to take away from this is co-residence with a father-in-law, positive, statistically significant effect, ranging depending on the data set, from 11 to 13%. Co-residence with a mother-in-law, by contrast, no significant effect on employment. All right. Our next strategy, estimation strategy, as I said, was this dynamic two-way fixed effects model using difference and differences. So what are we doing there? On the left-hand side, we have the same variable, employment, 1 if you're employed, 0 if the woman is not employed. And on the right-hand side, you have your standard dynamic two-way fixed effects model. So in which you have K leads from period -2 before the death to period K. So I should say period -K before the death to two periods before the death. And then you have L lag starting at the period of death. You have a bunch of controls on the right-hand side, individual fixed effects. And in this case, we're using CPHS data. So I can say it's time, but in this case, it's quadrimester fixed effects.
Raji, why do you stop
Yes.
at -2?
I don't. I go to -K. I start at -2 and go to, oh, yeah.
I mean, why not? Like, because the leads are 0 to L, and then the lags are -2 to -K.
Yeah, so sorry, I'm using this as lags, and this is
Okay. I mean, what I
where
mean,
I'm getting my language mixed
what
up.
happens
So
to
the before
-1?
period is K periods, and the after is L periods.
Right. So there's 0, then -1, then -2.
Yes.
So
Yes.
where is the -1?
It's the exclusion.
Okay, it's the exclusion relative to -1. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So standard two-way fixed effects model, and as I said, we're going to be using an improved double, it's a mouthful, improved doubly robust difference in differences estimator. Now, St. Anna and Zhao have a really lovely paper with lots of discussion about what you should be using as your counterfactual. I mean, the thing here about this sort of dynamic two-way fixed effects model is that your counterfactual is changing from period to period. In order to be more sure of parallel trends, so their first suggestion is that you use not yet treated women as a control group. What that means concretely, which is what we do, what that means concretely in our context is that we have this observation period of, we have 12 periods of observation. We look at women who co-resided with a parent-in-law, and we're going to do this separately, co-resided with a mother-in-law, co-resided with a father-in-law, and whose parent-in-law subsequently died over the observation period. Okay, effectively, that means that our control group is women who are not yet treated, where treatment in this case is that the parent-in-law died. We also do another, I'll show you if we have time, we do this estimation again with a never treated control group, meaning women whose parents-in-law never died, and the results are qualitatively identical. Okay, so in terms of our estimates, what do we see? We have the time of, on the left-hand side, we have the employment response to a father-in-law's death. On the right-hand side, we have the employment response to a mother-in-law's death. And what you see here is that prior to a father-in-law's death, there is no particular pattern. You reject the null hypothesis of their existing pre-trends. After a father-in-law's death, you see that employment goes up. Overall, the average treatment on the treated for father-in-law's death is 0.018, meaning employment increases by 1.8 percentage points following the death of a father-in-law, that's statistically significant. Mother-in-law, again, reject pre-trends, and you see there's really no action happening in terms of employment following her death. In fact, the ATT for a mother-in-law's death is a pretty precisely estimated 0. So again, this sort of completely echoes our results based on our IV fixed effects estimates. You can look at the never treated control, slightly different control, as I explained, and a very similar pattern. Okay, so those are our results. I've said it several times. Let me not say it again. What we do next is ask why. Why do we see this employment response? Well, why do women who live with fathers-in-law have lower employment, whereas women that live with their mothers-in-law don't? What's going on here? What can explain this effect? The first potential mechanism, which sort of echoes the causal channels that I laid out at the beginning of this presentation, is the income effect. What's the idea here? Well, if you believe that the negative income effect is at play, what we should see, so we're going to test this. I want to be careful. Test is a big word. We're going to look for corroborative evidence for the income effect in 2 different ways. One has the following intuition. If the income effect is at play, we should see a more positive employment response if the father-in-law was employed, i.e. income earning, than if he wasn't employed. All right, why? Because then you lose this income once a father-in-law dies, and then the woman needs to go out and earn some money. Okay, so more positive employment response after the death of an employed income earning father-in-law versus a not employed father-in-law. The second place we're going to look for some evidence of the income effect is the following. If it were at play, then you should expect that women living with richer fathers-in-law have a more negative income effect. In other words, their employment rates should be lower than women living with poorer fathers-in-law. Okay, the income effect should be larger in absolute value for those. The way we're going to look at that then is look at heterogeneous treatment effects. We should be careful. Heterogeneous estimates using our fixed effects estimates for women across different income and asset quartiles. The second channel was domestic responsibilities. If this is what's at play, then we should see that women have higher domestic workloads when they're co-residing with parents-in-law, if those increased domestic responsibilities are what's keeping them away from the labor market. Finally, social norms. We're going to use the women's questionnaire of IHDS here and ask 2 questions. The first is, who has decision-making authority in these who has decision-making authority at home, and do women have agency outside the home? Again, I want to be very clear here. I may slip and use because or results in, but really I want to be clear that this is really completely suggestive evidence. Okay, the first channel that we explore is whether a negative income effect may be at play. What we're doing here is really splitting our sample, right? We're taking our core CPHS sample and doing a sample split. On the left-hand side, you have the sample of women whose father-in-law was employed in at least 1 quadrimester prior to his death. You can define employment in different ways, and this qualitative result is going to hold through, by the way. All right. On the right-hand panel here, you have the sample of women whose father-in-law was not employed in the year prior to his death. What you can see here is that this positive employment response to a father-in-law's death that I showed you for the full sample a few slides ago is not being driven by employed fathers-in-law. It's being driven by fathers-in-law who were not employed. In other words, this isn't entirely consistent with an earned income effect. We should expect the opposite to be true if an earned income effect were at play. I said the second thing we're going to do is look at heterogeneous effects of living with a father-in-law. And the way we're going to do that is just take my basic econometric model and look at heterogeneous effects across different, on the left-hand side, income quintiles, and on the right-hand side, asset ownership quintiles. I should be careful here. I wish I could look at father-in-law's income and father-in-law's assets, but of course, I just know household income and assets. So this is really heterogeneous responses based on different household income and asset ownership. I would expect a decreasing pattern here, meaning women who live in households live with fathers-in-law in rich households should have a more negative estimate of beta than women who live with their fathers-in-law in poorer households. And what you see is that it's sort of all over the place. Okay, there's no perceptible pattern. So together, these two pieces of evidence are not consistent with a negative income effect. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, maybe it does. I just don't find any evidence for that in these data. Okay, the next channel that we wanted to explore was domestic responsibilities. And for that, we use the 2019 Indian Time Use Survey. Before I get to I mean, this is a cross section, right? So all of this is purely descriptive, but before I get to the descriptive results, let me just it's worth staring at these data for a second. These are just summary statistics, okay? It describes the kinds of categories I'm interested in looking at here. One is time spent on paid employment. And then we have domestic activities in 4 categories. Home production, all right? These are things like tending to little family plot or domestic animals or weaving baskets or whatever, right? Home production. The second is unpaid domestic work, which is mostly cooking and cleaning. Ashwini is actually, she has a really lovely paper exploring these things. The third domestic activity category is elder care. And the final one is childcare. There are other activities as well, obviously, in the time use survey. I'm just going to focus on domestic activities because that's the channel that I want to explore. The thing to notice is this in terms of domestic activities. Until the 75th percentile, there's nothing. There's no time. These are minutes, by the way, okay? Minutes spent on these activities. Women aren't engaging, according to these measures, in home production. Elder care, 1% of the sample does anything in the category of elder care. Childcare, you need to get into the upper 60th percentile to see activity in childcare. Why? Because it's mostly, women with younger children that are doing childcare. Now, I found this surprising when I first looked at it because my prior, and one of the questioners said this, would be that, living with parents-in-law, you just are maybe engaged in more elder care, right? But what I want you to take away from this sort of summary statistics table is the following. If domestic responsibilities is going to be a channel, then all the action is going to be taking place in the domestic work category, right? Because there's very little action in the other categories. In terms of domestic work, I should also say that the bulk of this in these data fall in 2 categories: cleaning and cooking. And there's this masterful movie. I don't know whether you've seen it. I'm forgetting the title of the movie. I'll post it later, but just about the drudgery of the Indian daughter-in-law who spends 18 hours a day cooking and cleaning and cooking and cleaning. All right, so is increased domestic responsibility as a potential channel. What I'm going to show here is, what I'm showing you here is the following. The first column here, this is first of all cross-section correlations. The first column here is logit estimates for employment. I'm doing exactly the same exercise that I showed you earlier for IHDS and CPHS, and consistent with that, you see that positive statistically significant coefficient, a negative statistically significant coefficient for co-residence with father-in-law, positive with mother-in-law, which is actually very similar to logit estimates for the IHDS. Earlier has a similar time frame as the TIFS data. Employment, So the next 6 columns are time spent on various types of activities. What you see is that co-residing with the father-in-law, women who co-reside spend fewer minutes on employment. So the question is, where is this time going in terms of, in this case, domestic activities? What you see is that really the largest category it's going into is domestic work. It's actually a little less on elder care, a little less on childcare, which maybe points to parents-in-law helping out, perhaps, I don't know, speculating wildly. You add all of these up, and overall, they're spending 6 more minutes in these domestic activities in total. Okay, so is there a shift? Yes, there's a shift. Yes, there's a shift, but it's 6 minutes, according to these data. With a mother-in-law, okay, actually a few more minutes on employment, also a few more minutes on home production. Actually, this aligns quite nicely with some of the work Ashwini's done. And, mixed in terms of these other activities. Overall, it's a wash, okay? In terms of there's no significant increase in domestic activities. Okay, what I really take away from this is, okay, maybe there's something to, being employed and, sorry, not being employed, but like having parents-in-law at home and having to step up in terms of domestic responsibilities, but it doesn't add up to an awful lot in terms of minutes. So I'm not ruling out that this is a potential channel, but it can't be the full story. So the third channel then is, third and final channel is cultural norms, restricting women's agency. So what are we going to do here? What I'm going to show you, so I'm going to show you a very busy graph in just a second. So let me tell you what I'm going to show you before I show it to you. Again, we're back to our friend, the original regression equation that I showed you. And on the left-hand side now is no longer employment. It's going to be responses to questions in the women's survey from IHDS regarding social norms governing women's activities. Again, different age group, and I'm going to estimate this using individual fixed effects because my instrument doesn't hold water in this younger age group. All right, what am I going to show you? Again, super busy graph. As you look at it, I'm going to be showing you estimates for beta F and beta M, but wait for it, I'll tell you what these are. This over here, if you read this column-wise, this is going to be an estimate for beta F and beta M in one regression, the next sort of vertical thing, beta F and beta M in another regression, and so forth. And there are 20 of these, all right? That's what I'm showing you. I'm showing estimates for beta F and beta M for 20 different regressions. On the left-hand side, what do I have? Well, these are questions in the women's survey asking who has the most say regarding 5 different things: an expensive purchase, child's marriage, treating a sick child, number of children, and what to cook. All right, that's what I'm going to show you. What do you see here? First of all, what are the responses? The woman, meaning the respondent, this would be my unit of interest. The woman, her husband, the senior male in the family, and the senior female in the family. Now, I want to be clear, it doesn't say the father-in-law or the mother-in-law, but almost without exception, the senior male in the family, in the households in which a father-in-law co-resides, that is the father-in-law. Similarly with the senior female. So I think it's fair to say that with very few exceptions, the senior male is the father-in-law, the senior female is the mother-in-law when they co-reside. So what do we see here? We see that a woman, it makes no difference, like if they live with a father-in-law and mother-in-law or not, they basically, in many of these dimensions, simply don't have decision-making authority. The one area where they have significantly less decision-making authority is in the kitchen, okay? With both father-in-law and mother-in-law co-residing. So woman doesn't have agency and decision-making authority, and she has even less in the kitchen. So the question is, who does have decision-making authority in the household? The next pair of graphs say that the answer is it's not the husband, all right? That's what this seems to indicate. The husband has significantly less decision-making authority when his father, remember the woman's father-in-law is his father, when his father co-resides, and slightly less than I'm doing double negative now. The magnitude is not as large as with his father co-residing, but he has a little less as well when his mother co-resides. So not the woman, definitely not the husband. Who is it? Well, the senior male, the father-in-law, right? So the father-in-law has, when he co-resides, he has decision-making authority in all dimensions, even in the kitchen to some extent. And the senior male, again, has decision-making authority as well when a mother-in-law co-resides. How about the senior female? Well, there's some action in terms of the first 4 dimensions, which really involve spending money in many of these cases. Where the senior female holds sway is in the kitchen. All right. Final set of results, also related to the social norms channel, is what happens. How is co-residence correlated with a woman's mobility and financial autonomy, both of which are very important considerations when you're thinking about women's labor force participation. What you see here are estimates for beta F and beta M in terms of whether a woman needs permission to go to the local shop, relative's home, and health center. And you can see that when she co-resides with a father-in-law, and to slightly lesser extent in the case of the local shop with a mother-in-law, she's more likely to need permission to visit these places. She's less likely to be able to go alone to these places, especially if she lives with a father-in-law. In terms of financial autonomy, she's equally likely to have her name on a bank account as women living in nuclear or fraternal households, but she's significantly less likely to hold cash in hand, which is sort of the de facto financial autonomy in what is largely a cash economy. Let me wrap up. In conclusion, what we find is that fathers-in-law are what seems to matter for married women's employment. Co-residence with a father-in-law, according to our IB fixed effects estimates, results in an 11 to 13% reduction in employment of married women in India. Co-residence with a mother-in-law, by contrast, has no significant effect. This, I don't know, I found this surprising when I first saw it because it didn't clearly fit with my stereotypes. But you can't get rid of it, at least across the methods and data that we use. It's remarkably consistent across data sets and across estimation strategies. In terms of potential channels, we don't have strong support, certainly, for the negative income effect in our evidence. Increased domestic responsibilities, maybe. And also maybe a matter of measurement. Maybe we're classifying things in domestic activities that should be classified elsewhere. But if domestic responsibilities is issued, the magnitudes seem too small for that to be the full story. The most compelling explanation that we have in these data would be social norms, and really one in which gender and generational norms intersect, resulting in, and this is evidenced in conservative parents-in-law having more say and placing more restrictions on daughter-in-law's agency. Let me stop there. Thank you all very much for being here. And if you have any comments or questions that we don't cover, then please send me an email. This is really hot off the press. I haven't even submitted it anywhere yet. So if you have any comments, they'd be most welcome. Thank you.
That was intense. Thank you very much, Raji, for a wonderful presentation and a very intense paper. You have a few questions if you'd like to take them in the Q&A session.
Happy to. So the first question, okay, so I guess I'll read the question and then answer it. Do you think household fixed effects are not suitable here instead of individual fixed effects? So the reason we go with individual fixed effects is that variation really comes from within the individual across time. If I just had household fixed effects, then variation could come across women in the same household. And I mean, as I said, even individual fixed effects doesn't fix the problem. It's at least within an individual, and I don't need to worry about sort of endogeneity along two women within, with two women in the same household, which is why we go with individual fixed effects rather than household fixed effects. So of course, individual fixed effects subsumes household fixed effects in that context. Are there any heterogeneous treatment effects? George asks that question. I'd be very interested in hearing what types of heterogeneous treatment effects you're interested in, George. What I will say is this: we don't go there just because we don't have the statistical power to do that. We get identification over a surprisingly few number of observations, and you can see that when you think of where our identification is coming from once we have individual fixed effects. Once we have individual fixed effects, all of my variation is coming from changes in a given woman's co-resident status, and then with the IB, it's really being driven by that woman's parents dying. So then within that sample, which is giving me all of my variation, samples become really, really small. And then if I cut that further with heterogeneous treatment effects, and I just don't have statistical power to identify heterogeneous treatment effects. So I really wish I could. It would be super interesting. And there are dimensions that would be especially, I would love to do caste, for instance, heterogeneity across caste. I just don't have the power, statistical power to do that. Anonymous attendee, can you control for household income? Yeah, I could control for household income in some data sets, not in other data sets. So in principle, I could do that for IHDS data. Yeah, certainly try that.
Also for CPHS. And
for CPHS, yeah. I can't for the time use, yeah. And then you may have covered this, but I was wondering if education status at the time the woman joins a new family has any differential effects or different agency, especially if she is capable of earning. Again, a great question, Preeti. This sort of points to the question that was asked earlier in terms of heterogeneous treatment effects. It's, again, when I start cutting the data, I lose a lot of power. Anonymous attendee, do these mobility autonomy measures change when the father-in-law and mother-in-law die? Good question. Good question. I can look that up. Okay. Okay. Nick, hi Nick. Nick Lee, I should say to everyone here, is the one that really generously shared his time use survey data with us with all the clean data files. So Nick, you're my star. Thank you. I was wondering if you could translate the time use findings to percent terms to be comparable to the employment results. Okay, that's I don't know. The answer is yes, I can, and also I haven't yet. So thank you for the suggestion. George, thank you. All right, one more question. How might the results be different? Oh, such a good question. How might the results be different in a more matrilocal culture area of India, like Kerala? I can speculate wildly, George. I think we sort of all have the same prior, probably, regarding what these things would look like in the matrilocal culture. Really interesting question, because, if I just flipped it on its head and I said married men in Kerala instead of married women in the rest of India, it would be really fascinating. If you have the data for me, let me know.
Kerala is not as matrilocal anymore as...
It's just the Nayars, right? I don't know if the rest is.
Even that has changed a lot.
Not even.
Yeah, so it used to be matrilineal and matrilocality was a big cultural feature, but it's no longer. So it's
no longer. I think it's only the Todas that really do that anymore. Okay. State level differences. Yes, again, super interesting question. Don't have statistical power to do that. Thank you all for your questions. Can I get copies of these questions later, Mahesh? Maybe
Oh, yes.
that would be wonderful.
Yes,
Thank you.
You will get copies of these
Great.
questions with the
Thank you.
IDs of the people as well. Thank you so much for
Fantastic. Thank
patiently
you so much for the
answering all
questions.
those questions. Now over to you, Ashwini, for your comments.
Yeah, okay. Slideshow. Yeah, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So first of all, thank you, Raji, for the wonderful paper and also very nicely presented, very lucidly presented. It was a pleasure to read. It's written very clearly. And it's very close to my heart in the sense of the question of, female labor force participation, female employment, what factors matter, what factors don't. So in that sense, I found it super interesting. There is a mandatory summary slide, but I'm not going to read it out because Raji's done an excellent job, summarizing her results at the end, and she also presented very clearly. So I'll move straight on. So I have to say it was amusing for me to be seen, described as a part of the supply side explanations, because I'm actually one of those who believes that the demand side is hugely neglected. I know that my paper with Naila is about domestic chores, and but my paper with Jitendra Singh, which is also you referred to, actually we question the predominant supply side narrative, and we point to some new features using the CPHS data, which also I'll talk about. And I also have questions about, I don't have any views about father-in-law versus mother-in-law. I think because even when the mother-in-law matters, she's really representing the patriarchal attitudes of her husband. So it's not as though she has some original patriarchy ingrained into her in some dramatic way or anything like that. So I have no views on, no particular views on, I mean, the results are very interesting, but I have no particular views on mother versus father-in-law, but I do have something else to say about some of the things that you've talked about. So I'll say that. So one is, you've explained this, and for the benefit of the listeners, I'll just state that once more, because the reason I'm going to state that again is because it has implications also for what you find in your time use. So I just want to sort of lay it out on the table. Actually, if you see the employment figures that Raji has summarized from IHDS, India Human Development Survey, not only are they extremely high, which is 40% and 44%, over the period, they actually have increased, which is precisely the period which, according to NSS, has seen a decline in labor force participation rates. And CPHS also records this. And so when you talk about the Indian female labor force participation rate issue, I think there are two distinct problems that are related in some ways, but they are not synonymous. So one is the low level historically, and the other is the decline. So, you're not talking about the decline, so that's all right. That's totally okay. But a lot of the discussion about this issue sort of conflates the two issues and makes the discussion very complicated and simplistic to the point of, losing the plot somehow. But I think we need to be mindful of the low level versus the decline. And that brings me, so you've obviously explained very clearly in the paper as well as in the presentation what accounts for the differences in the magnitudes, the averages across IHDS and CPHS. So in the IHDS, as Raji said, whether a woman works in an income generating activity, and so it's the income generating activity for the family, not necessarily for the woman herself. So what the IHDS captures really, really well is women's work on what are called economic activities, or what are called the SNA activities in the time use survey data, regardless of whether the woman is individually paid for it or not. So it's income generating activity for the family. And by implication, the woman is, getting a part of it, but she may not actually get paid. And I'm going to show a table from the TUS 2019 to highlight this point. CPHS definition is much stricter. were you employed yesterday? Were you working in paid employment yesterday? That's really what it is. And that's what it's more like the daily status coming from the NSS. And which is what, first of all, lowers the level. And it's a very, very strict definition of being employed. So IHDS is more like, in some sense, labor force participation as opposed to employment, whereas CPH is strictly speaking employment in the way we understand it. You find similar effects of the father-in-law or not, that's another story. But I think it's important to understand exactly, because in TUS, when we come to TUS, I'll show you why, why this matters really in terms of the TUS. And the low level, by the way, is a lot of it is the failure to count women's work in families' income generating activities. So it's a lot of it is a measurement problem, which actually the IHDS has solved in some sense, which is why in IHDS you find a much higher rate of female labor force participation compared to all other surveys. So it's really a lot is about in the measurement story. It's not so much about employment rate. So I would be careful about using the word employment rate when I'm talking about the IHDS. You can talk about labor force participation, that's fine. And with the caveat that it's really the measurement of work that the IHDS has managed to improve. All right, so that's about the definition, and I'll show you why that matters for TUS. One thing that I was struck by is that given that, in the paper you begin by saying over 70% of Indian women reside with the parents-in-law after marriage, which is patrilocality, both data sets actually show much lower levels, much lower percentages of women and men who live with the in-laws. And so I was wondering, where the 70% figure comes from, and which sounds right to me, but I don't know. I mean, it's an empirical question to my mind. But why is it so low in the sample? I just found that very surprising. And as you explained, co-residence in CPHS is much smaller than IHDS because the proportion of urban households in CPHS are higher. So there's a small typo there which you might want to correct. It's double, not 3 times. So no big deal, but it's just a typo that you might want to correct. Now, a lot of questions have come about if the father-in-law's death is the instrument, then what else is changing with the father-in-law's death? Right? A lot of questions have alluded to that. And in some sense, that's really, I feel like there is a little bit of unpacking to be done. Maybe we may not be able to do it given the data that we have, but it's worth thinking about these issues. So you refer to, the paper refers to controlling for family composition. And I just wanted to understand a little bit about what is meant by family composition. I mean, what exactly is being controlled for? So for example, a highly likely scenario particularly in urban India is once the father-in-law dies, who's the patriarch of the family, it may result in many other changes. For example, sons start living on different floors of the same house. So it may be the same physical building, but it may be different kitchens, which by NSS definition is a different household, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the data may not allow us to look at all that, but a lot might change after the father-in-law's death. The reason that it matters is because a large part of the paper is focused on mechanisms, and you are pushing for the social norm story. And if other things are also changing as a result of the father-in-law's death, then I wonder, in terms of mechanisms, what is it that we can really talk about? Is it really the father-in-law's death in terms of, this domineering patriarch dying, and it sort of frees up various things, including the women's ability to take up paid employment, right? So that seems to be the social norm story, and that may or may not be the case. I can totally see in certain households that to be the case, but there may be more to it than meets the eye. So I'm going to just park it here, and I just want to understand. Would like some more explanation in the paper about when you say we are controlling for family composition. What exactly is controlled for? What do we know about before and after father-in-law's death about changes in family composition? So that would really be important for the mechanisms. Now, in terms of the effect of the father-in-law's death, which is your figure 2, which you also showed in the slides. Now, so many questions about that. So one is, when are we looking at the effect? So if you look at, is it literally the next period or a couple of periods after that? Now, the paper that you referred to, my paper with Jitendra Singh, and I believe he's also in the audience, we've used CPHS data, and what we've also done this wave by wave analysis, exactly the same 12 waves that you've analyzed. And we find that women make repeated entry and exit into the labor force and out of it. And this is the strict same definition of employment that you've used as well. Our explanation for that is that it's a demand side story. And we now actually have a second paper coming up where we are more clearly establishing the demand side story. Whereas in that paper, we hint at the demand side because we look at all the conventional supply side factors and we find those not to explain the entry and the exit. And so our conjecture in that paper is that it's a demand side. Now we have another paper coming up very soon, which actually shows that. So if it is a question of repeated entry and exits, which you will also find actually in the same data, was the same data, what happens after the father-in-law's death? So are these women never in the labor force and then they enter the labor force, or does it change the pattern of entry and exit into the labor force? Because that would give it a totally different complexion. So it's not so much, so obviously something changes with the father-in-law's death. But again, then the question about the social norm story become a little stronger. Similarly, if you look at the figure 2A, which was your left-hand side figure, in the difference and differences, the event study kind of a framework where zero is father-in-law's death, and you look at the subsequent periods, you see a slightly significant increase. I say slightly because it does overlap a little bit with the zero, the lower part of the confidence interval line, but we can ignore that. But as time passes, the point estimates increase for sure, but also the standard errors are larger. So, if you believe the standard errors matter, then, we have to think a little bit about what's going on as time passes. So in other words, how significant is the increase in women's employment after the father-in-law's death? And for how many periods? How long does it last? Is it like a permanent change that takes place in the family structure, etc.? So these are questions to be thought about. So in other words, my question is it like women were not in the labor force, now are able to enter the labor force because this domineering patriarch is gone, and then they stay in employment, that would be the real social norm story, if that were to happen. But my question is that what is happening? And if it is, then the paper needs to make that clearer. I was really intrigued by the home production figures. In other words, your sort of a lot of zeros in the data, and that you really find that women are not predominantly working home production. I just did a paper which is not out yet only on TUS data. And this is, what the TUS defines as system of national accounts, SNA activities, which are economic activities, regardless of whether they are paid or unpaid. So as I mentioned earlier, a few slides back, women do a lot of SNA activities, which are activities that get conventionally counted in the national income of a country, which are regarded as conventional economic activities. But when women do it, a lot of the times those activities are unpaid. And if you look at paid SNA activities, of course, the male and female, time spent is different. Women spend less time on paid SNA activities. That's well known. But when you look at when you look at unpaid activities, women actually spend much more time on unpaid SNA activities compared to men. And this is not cooking, cleaning, etc. These are not the activities that are included there. I have a whole section on the paper in this. And so, this is just from the TUS report, what kinds of activities are included in SNA production. So, this is employment and household enterprises to produce goods, enterprises to provide services, etc., etc. And the fact that women are involved in the unpaid version of these activities fits in with almost everything that, sociological as well as economic literature on this question. So I'm really surprised by your TUS numbers. So it might be worth us having a chat about it later, or, just sort of figuring out where the discrepancy is coming from. So it must be something in the cleaning of the data that's producing that, but it's worth looking at it because this, and I've done a lot of stuff by SNA participants, non-SNA participants, and it's a pretty consistent story where women's time is actually double, you can see done it across different cuts, done it across states, et cetera, and, women spend 2 to 3 to whatever time, 2.3 is the average ratio of female to male time on unpaid SNA activities, which is all the other, what you're calling home production. Another graph again from the US showing 12 kinds of unpaid activities. So this is female, this is with controls. The earlier one was without controls. Female time relative to male time on about 12 activities. Anyway, so I won't belabor the point there. Finally, social norms. And, again, this is a little bit of a pet theme with me, which is, of course, social norms matter. I mean, who would argue against that, right? India, South Asian countries have distinctly patriarchal social norms that put a lot of constraints on women. And there's no doubt about that, right? But when you say things like filial piety, when there is a dominant patriarch present in the family, I believe that it affects both decision-making by sons and by daughters-in-law. It's not as though sons are, free to make their own decisions and daughters-in-law decisions are affected, right? And your graphs actually show that as well. So I think the cultural norm story there is a little more complicated than just the father-in-law's presence affecting women's indicators, but not really. Unfortunately, what happens with a lot of these questionnaires is that only women are asked these questions about decision-making and mobility. And so you can't really, compare the same things for men. But when you talk about filial piety, I would broaden that discussion. And again, data may not be able to help there, but at least acknowledge the fact that having a dominant patriarch matters both, constrains both men and women. Sons also feel incredibly oppressed by their fathers, especially if their fathers are overbearing. So at least nod to that. If not, data is not going to show it to us because we don't have decision-making and autonomy and mobility indicators for men. We only have them for women for good reasons. But anyway, finally, again, this is a little bit of a pet peeve, which is about how do you assess, say, across cultural contexts, right? Now, we know that we think of the woman being the sole decision maker in a variety of contexts as an indicator of say, all right? But, and I've said this before in talks and in podcasts, et cetera, is that in South Asia, in some sense, jointly deciding with husband is not necessarily, or jointly going with friends or something, is not always an indicator of not having say. I always give my own example here, and I think as researchers, we should always put these questions to ourselves and try to answer them. And, that often changes the perspective. So for example, I've purchased expensive jewelry, I've purchased property in my own name, I've purchased automobiles in my own name, I travel alone everywhere. But honestly speaking, when it's an expensive purchase, I don't take that decision on my own. I don't want to do it, and I don't think it shows me any less empowered than it doesn't reduce my empowerment levels, and I don't know what it is like in the West, but certainly here in India and in South Asia, similarly going for entertainment, or even going to a hospital for that matter, because hospitals are not cut out to handle single individual patients. Indian hospitals and healthcare system is so complicated and so difficult that you need somebody with you to just negotiate the whole crazy mess of, if you're admitted, who's going to buy the medicines, who's going to. So I'm not obviously not defending any conservative social norms, that goes without saying. All I'm saying is that indicators of say or indicators of autonomy across cultural contexts might vary a little bit. And it's okay, I think, to acknowledge that as researchers working on women's empowerment and female labor force participation, et cetera, et cetera. So finally, let's assume it's social norms. Okay, I'm not fully convinced, but let's assume for argument's sake that it's social norms. So what is to be done about it? You know, where is all this leading us, right? Are these like fixed in stone, and so therefore for 200 years nothing can change, or can things actually change? So first of all, as long as the material conditions for patriarchality exist, right, which are the same conditions also for son preference, which is sons provide old age support, there are ritual reasons you need son to light your funeral pyre, blah, 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 all of those things, multi-generation families will persist. But with all of these social norms, in urban India, you do see a much higher proportion of nuclear families. In families who believe in these, who have strong son preference, who believe in, you know, my funeral pyre should be lit by my son, or my son will provide me old age support, whereas my daughter is Paraya Dhan, she belongs to another household, etc. So with the same mindset, with the same social norms, you do see that in urban India, because conditions of living are different, you do see nuclear families. So my point, which again I make repeatedly, that these norms are not set in stone, right? So what can be done to shift the needle here, right? So obviously the presence of a dominant matriarch or a dominant patriarch, you know, stifling dissent and imposing their will does put a cost, you know, does affect women's abilities, or even men's for that matter, decision making. To what extent does it affect their labor force participation rate? I mean, is it really truly the case that there's a plentiful availability of high-wage jobs that women can do? They're easy to access, but the only reason they're not doing it because there's a, you know, a dominant mother-in-law or a father-in-law sitting at home and saying you cannot go out. I mean, does that story sound right to us? To my ears, it doesn't, right? Look at Bangladesh, for example. How did the social norms story change in Bangladesh? How did they get from 3% to 36% to now 40%? And here is paid employment, not work in family, not unpaid work in family enterprises, which India is characterized with. Okay, so when jobs were made available, women left their very conservative homes and started working. They were low-wage jobs. They were not decent jobs. Now there's a lot of discussion in the context of Bangladesh about jobs should be better, blah, 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 all of that. And of course, all that is true. We need decent work. We need good work. We need work that's less exploitative. But the cycle got broken by the creation of employment, not by saying, okay, mindsets have to change, and fathers-in-law should just be nicer to their daughters-in-law, and therefore, you know, change will come. So I really believe that non-availability of jobs is a very large part of the story. Literally in no survey that I have seen, a large-scale survey, have women said, we don't want to work, even if work is made available. NSS has asked this question. I have asked this question in every single survey I've done. IHDS has some other kinds of questions, but their employment anyways is calculated differently. So I think that we need to just broaden the discussion to think about also the demand side story. What you are estimating is a marginal effect of the father-in-law's, whatever, and that's totally fine. As an investigative, but when we sit back and look at the larger picture on social norms, I do think that we need to bring all these conversations into play and recognize that there is a lot of unpaid economic work that women do, which is the home production story in the TUS that goes unrecognized. So in Bangladesh, we have seen a decline in son preference and maybe alter family structures as well. And in India, we need to start that conversation about what is it that what does all this say for in terms of change and labor force participation rates. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Can I go now, Mahesh? I mean, go meaning, can I speak now? Just because, Ashwini, thank you so much. That was an incredible discussion. There's so many fantastic points and fantastic questions. If I can possibly get a copy of those slides, that would be,
Of course,
that
yeah,
would be
of course.
great.
Sure.
That would be great. I mean, such a thoughtful discussion. Thank you. Maybe I can go through a few of, I'm not going to be able to cover everything because it was
you can take your time, Raji.
Okay, all right,
the
fantastic.
floor is
Then let
entirely
me,
yours.
great. Let me maybe try and, I'm not going to do justice to all of them because I'll be honest, some of them I haven't thought about and I just need to sit back and think about them because you've thought about this much more deeply than I have. So again, thank you. Okay, the point regarding employment and differences in definitions, very important point, absolutely taken. And the distinction between CPHS being employment and IHDS being capturing more labor force participation, also correct. So we'll definitely be more clear about that. I guess even for me, like, please, I'd like you to correct me if I'm misreading this because you have a better understanding of it than I do. But I guess for me, what is striking in that context is that both of these data sets yield such consistent results in terms of our analysis, which you're right, is not seeing how, you know, employment is changing over time or anything. It's really this marginal analysis. So that's something that I find striking, but still we need to be clear about the fact that they're measuring slightly different things. Excellent point. Mechanisms. I think that we need to maybe clear up just the wording a little bit because the 70%, and I was trying to look back at the exact word that I used. So what I say in the paper, and I'm just going to say this to read it, over 70% of married Indian women co-reside with parents-in-law upon marriage. And I think that's a bad choice of word. What I meant is as soon as they get married. And then it declines, which is why you have an average co-residence rate of whatever, 19%, whereas directly upon marriage, it's, you know, almost all women are co-residing. So I need to use a different word, I think, than upon. So over a woman's life cycle, the average is 19%, but as soon as they get married, almost all of them are living with parents-in-law. It just declines over the life cycle, which is that discrepancy between.
But that's again interesting because then it suggests that patrilocality is not that strong then as a feature, right?
Well, I mean, there are a few reasons, right? It is upon marriage, right? It is. Once you get married, you move to your husband's house, and then there are at least two reasons why that declines over time. One is that they die, or that you move out, and both of those things are happening in this context. So it's not a, you know, permanent. In the younger age groups, like you start off pretty much living with
it's important to just, because in the descriptive stats you see the figures are much lower, so it just might be.
I think I need to use a different word, saying immediately after they get married, almost all women live with their parents-in-law, and that's where the 70% is coming from. So one is a life cycle average, and the other is within a certain age group, which is early in the age distribution. In terms of composition, honestly, we just don't have much to go by in terms of composition. We're using the number of people in different age groups. We do different configurations of that, the number of dependents, the household size, whatever else. The thing is that we need to be, the reason we can't just use household size is that that's really collinear with co-residence with parents-in-law, because mechanically the household size falls. Yeah, so we need to make this a little more lumpy in the data to be able to separately identify that. What else changes after father-in-law's death? We can look at that. The thing is that, like with all of this stuff, in terms of the mechanisms, maybe I can clarify something. At several stages, you said, you know, like when a father-in-law dies, all sorts of stuff is changing. No doubt, absolutely no doubt, all sorts of stuff is changing. And then like all of these things sort of affect norms. I'm sure that's also true. But the thing is that most of our analysis of, well, all of our analysis of social norms comes from the IHDS data set, and they were not at all using the death of a father-in-law. It's just the presence of a father-in-law in the household. Where we use the death of a father-in-law is really just in one place in the mechanism section, which is looking directly at what happens after the death of a father-in-law following separately for employed and not employed fathers-in-law. The rest of the stuff is really not exploiting death at all. It's co-residence, really. So I need to make that a little clearer. In terms of, so first of all, my apologies. The reason I have your paper listed is that you do, the one with Singh, is that you do look at you do look at these demand versus supply side explanations. I was thinking, my God, like Ashwini is the master. She's discussing my paper. She's written all these papers because you're a strong, advocate and believer in the demand side. I didn't have that many references to put in. I only talked about references in the supply side here. So.
No, it's fine.
But you do talk about, I mean, the one
I
with,
do
the first author, you do talk about it, and the other one is sort of a horse race between the two. So I'm not saying you're an advocate of the supply side, but you talk about the supply side as well. So. In terms of the effect of the father-in-law, you're right in our two-way fixed effects analysis. As you go further and further away, you get these super large standard errors. I think what's different from our paper and yours is that because our control group is the not yet treated group, we're not talking about 1.9 million women anymore. We're talking about tens of thousands. It's a tiny sample. And then, of course, if I'm going to go like 12 periods or 10 periods after father-in-law's death, that means that these are like the people whose father-in-law died very early in the observation period, if I get to observe them so long afterwards, and then the sample sizes get super small, so the standard errors just blow up. So I think that's just an artifact of the sample restriction due to the control group that we choose. The TUS data, okay, I absolutely have to double check that. The truth of the matter is that I sort of took them off the shelf. I haven't looked at them in great detail. And if what I see in the pattern, and these are just descriptive statistics, right? It's not anything fancy. If what I'm seeing is systematically different than what you're seeing, that is problematic. So I have to go back.
I mean, it may just be some definitional issue, possibly. But
I don't think so. These are mechanical categories, right? So I don't think so.
It's good to check what's.
I don't think so. And I mean, I don't want to go into the weeds here, but do you have did what you showed me, were those averages?
Yeah.
Okay,
so
so that's pretty consistent. The point is that like the averages are there, and I think the averages, I couldn't look very carefully when you were showing this, but the averages you do have time spent, but it's just that the distributions are super skewed, right? So to the extent like pushing women into the labor force, that action is not going to come. That action is only going to come if you go from 0 to sometime, right? And the problem with the averages and such a skewed distribution is that it's not really capturing the mass of zeros.
No, it's
yeah. Okay, so it's possible that our results are consistent.
Not that inconsistent.
Decision making. Actually, you said when a father-in-law, like you're absolutely right, in these patriarchal filial systems, like the poor son, honestly, the poor son. It's not just the daughter-in-law, it's the poor son. And you said you can't really measure this, but actually we sort of see that, right? When you look at decision-making authority in the family, okay, the woman is, sort of being hammered in the kitchen, but the son is being hammered everywhere. And the dad is the one calling the shots. So, I mean, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's in some ways the coolest. It's descriptive, but it's the coolest result in the paper in many ways. I don't know. I don't want to make hay of it because it's descriptive at the end of the day, but that really hit me in the face when I saw it. So your point, don't say. Absolutely, you're right. Say means very different things to different people and in different cultures, and even within a culture, like what is safe for me is not necessarily what's safe for you. And we shouldn't use that word, period. But I think that point, it's such an important point, and it also sort of segues nicely into your last slide, which is how can the cycle be broken? I always hesitate after papers like this to say anything about policy, just because it just seems like sort of wild speculation, and it's not. I'm not examining.
I mean, I totally get that. I mean, but the problem that happens is that it's this idea that it's the conservative social norms in places like India are keeping women indoors is such a pervasive belief that every paper is touted out like, oh, see, this paper shows that. Oh, see, that this paper shows that, So I just feel like, I know that papers such as yours are, and every paper should not have policy implications. There's no need, really. I get that totally. But it would be just nice also in the discussion session towards the end to step back a little bit.
Yeah.
And
let me run an idea by you.
Paper is like, oh, this paper shows this, and so obviously, father-in-law, you're not going to kill fathers-in-law because you want to increase the labor force participation rates, right? So I think it'll be just nice to.
Okay, can I run a few ideas by you?
Yes.
Potentially for that? Okay.
Sure.
So one idea is, so many interventions because we think, oh, you're right. It drives me nuts. I find it culturally, there's a lack of understanding when people say, oh, these Indians, they're women. I find it personally irritating. But one option, okay, these may be two sort of big picture things, but like a problem with, I think, econ in general is that we start with problems being individual optimization problems. And our idea of individual decision making, at best, we have some household bargaining model or something, right? But even that is sort of a bit limiting in that context. In the Indian context, a lot of these decisions, you're right, like it happens with me and my family. I think I have say, but the type of, it's a joint, like it's genuinely a joint decision-making problem. It's not an individual decision-making problem that's somehow tempered by some kind of bargaining deal. And so I think one thing, sort of big picture thing that one takes away from this is that a lot of our interventions, it's not like target two things. Shouldn't be targeted at the individual because these are joint household sort of optimization problems, and anything that's individually targeted in this labor market context, if you believe my results, should involve the family somehow. The other part of that, and it's sort of like a corollary to that, is that it's not, a lot of the time we just focus on the husband, and maybe it's the father-in-law as well that should be brought into this discussion. Not so much the mother-in-law, because honestly, she's an appendage, as you were saying, like sort of an instrument for the father-in-law's patriarchal power. The other part which is that you made is actually, you're making a deeper point, which is norms are one equilibria. Yeah, there are many other equilibria that we could end up at. And sometimes you need this exogenous push, which is why I think that you are so convinced that it's demand side explanations. That, I mean, sometimes that's your big push, right? You're saying if there's this demand side story that could push us out of the current equilibrium into a better one. So you're right. Any kind of recommendation that our policy thing that I make, that's going to be like piddly little in equilibrium nudges at best. And what you're saying, I don't think that our two, again, okay, so and what you're saying is that actually what we need is not little, adjustments around the margin. We need a big push that's going to get us to this better equilibrium that is then self-reinforcing once we're there. Yeah, I mean, I don't view it so much as a competition between demand side and supply side, but I completely agree with. So I'm not saying there doesn't exist demand side explanations.
No, I
know
you're
both
not
of those things
right.
exist, but I think I'm inclined. Let me ask you a question, Ashwini. Why couldn't we have norms? Like, just, I guess my norms are resilient, right? So I was going to say, why can't we just have a switch in norms as the big push? But norms are really resilient, so we really need like a demand side, but big push.
We should definitely have norm shifting conversations and norm shifting signaling. It does matter. It does make a difference. And, it's, in some level, I've said that earlier as well. So I'm repeating that, the current Prime Minister of India, he enjoys he's very popular. He enjoys a huge mandate. And it would be fantastic if the Prime Minister were to use his individual charisma, popularity to signal progressive norms around gender and about women. I mean, people listen to him.
They would be equilibrium shattering, right? I mean,
absolutely. So I I'm not saying that norms don't matter. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be shifted.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that sometimes when you push the material conditions, like urbanization, for example, why does it change so many practices? It's because the way people start living in cities is different from the way they were living in villages, and that happens. And so similarly, I'm just saying, create the jobs, let women go out. Maybe some norms will start to change. Anyway, Mahesh is...
Okay, sorry, Mahesh, we've overstayed our welcome.
Mahesh, you're muted.
It's the usual problem. Sorry. So there's a question. Preeti talks about Prime Minister Narendra Modi has recently said. Would you like to respond to that, Ashwini?
Yeah, I think that was a good announcement, Preeti. But the problem is that the ability to work remotely from home using technology is available to a very tiny sliver of Indian women. And I think what I'm interested in is about, this is domestic chores. I'm alone at home and the bell is ringing. What we are interested in is shifting the needle for an entire spectrum of women, not just to those who have the ability to work remotely, using digital technologies. Of course, they should be able to, but other women who cannot work from, their work is such that they cannot work remotely, they should also be able to work, right? So, Preeti, I think it's a good beginning, but I think it needs to be buttressed and followed up with a lot else, and other things as well. Women's ability to work outside also, should be matched with women's ability to wear what they want to wear, to travel safely to places, to eat what they want to eat, etc., to marry who they want to marry. So you need autonomy and decision making in a whole range of spheres, and I think it would be very good for norms to shift along all of those aspects, and for the Prime Minister and his government to signal that they tolerate, their goal is complete gender equality. So I would really welcome that very much. Yes.
Okay.
Just adding to what Ashwini said, I mean, we've talked a lot in the economics literature about the importance of role models who look like us, right? So the importance of female role models for women, or, Black role models for Black kids, or lower caste role models for lower caste kids. But this is a little different than role models, right? This is a different kind of mechanism, someone that has the megaphone and has the power to shift the equilibrium. And given that we live in a patriarchal culture, it has to be men in some ways.
I agree completely, Rajan.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. We have had a wonderful nearly 2 hours of discussion on your paper. Raji, your paper has spurred so many thoughts and has really got Ashwini discussing it a great deal. So thanks a lot, Ashwini, for all your wonderful comments for Raji. It will help her a lot in honing the paper a lot.
It's a great paper, Mahesh. It's very good.
Ashwini, it was a great discussion. Thank you so much.
So we have a couple of questions more, but I think I will have to call the session to an end in a couple of minutes. So unless there are short answers to Divya and Vijayan, we will call it an end. There's another one coming up. Oh, Raju, you're really getting people to tell us. I'm not going to stop till
this is.
So you're free to answer. The session doesn't have to end right here.
Okay. Divya, patriarchal attitude of mother-in-law, the Indian context could make a difference on the demand side. Yeah. So mother-in-laws in some ways, perhaps. On the demand side, women may not find suitable jobs. That's right. So Divya, there's a large economics literature, I think, on both of these things. Much of it Ashwini has contributed to as well. Preeti, Amitabh Bachchan is promoting changes in social norms. So interesting, Preeti, because like a co-author and I had signed Amitabh Bachchan on this kind of a project a few years ago, and I'm glad that it's happening. What is the effect of education? Again, Vijayan, there's a massive literature on this, and the answer is sort of mixed, actually. And then anonymous entity. Oh, okay, same as the previous one. Yeah. Okay,
Okay.
I guess that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Rajiv, a lot for your presentation and the patience with which you answered all the questions. Thank you, Ashwini, for really lighting up this discussion this evening. And thank you to all the wonderful audience that participated so actively in this. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mahesh.
Have-
Thank you very much, Ashwini.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening and have a wonderful day, Raji.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye.